Rain hammered against the chapel windows the night. I almost lost her forever. Her wedding dress soaked through as she ran from the altar and into my arms instead of his. 6 months earlier, I never could have imagined that selling my dead wife's car would lead me to the one woman who could bring me back to life. I never could have imagined that loving her would mean fighting a war against everyone who claimed to care about us, including my own son. This is the story of how grief nearly buried me, and how one impossible phone call from a stranger cracked my heart wide open again. My name is James Calloway. I'm 54 years old, and for 3 years I've been a man who forgot how to feel anything except the ache of losing my wife. Margaret died of cancer, slow and cruel, and when she went, she took most of me with her. The only piece of her I kept whole was her car, a cherry red 1967 Mustang she bought with her own money before we ever met, the one thing in this world she loved almost as much as she loved our son. I found out he sold it on a Tuesday morning, standing in my empty garage, staring at the oil stain where it used to sit. My son Tyler is 24, restless, and always chasing something just out of reach. He'd been begging me for money to take some girl to Paris, some grand romantic gesture he swore would change his life. I said no. I didn't know he'd find another way. I called him screaming that day, my voice cracking in ways I hadn't let it crack since the funeral. He said he was sorry, that he panicked, that the money was already spent on plane tickets he couldn't cancel. I hung up on my own son and sat on the cold concrete floor of that garage until the sun went down, grieving Margaret all over again like she'd just died a second time. 3 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as Walter Greer, owner of a classic car dealership 2 towns over, the one Tyler sold a Mustang to. He said he needed to speak with me in person about something he found inside the car, something he said I deserved to know before he resold it to anyone else. I drove out there with my chest tight, expecting nothing more than paperwork or formality. Instead, Walter led me to a back office and set a small wooden box on the desk between us. He said his mechanic found it hidden beneath the driver's seat, welded into a compartment so well hidden it took hours to even notice it existed. Inside were old photographs, a folded letter yellowed with age, and a key that didn't match anything on the car. The letter was addressed to Margaret. Not from me, from someone named Elise Rivera, dated 2 years before Margaret and I ever met. The words inside spoke of love, of a promise broken, of a woman who said goodbye to my wife long before I ever became part of her story. I sat frozen in that office chair, holding proof of a piece of Margaret's life she never once mentioned in 22 years of marriage. Walter told me something even stranger. The woman who bought the car that same week, paying cash, insisting on this exact model despite 3 others available on the lot, was named Elise Rivera. Same name, same handwriting, when Walter compared it to the note she'd left with her contact information. He said he felt obligated to tell me before finalizing anything, because something about the whole situation felt too strange to ignore. I got her number from Walter and sat in my car in that parking lot for nearly an hour before I found the courage to call. Her voice on the line was soft, careful, like she was bracing for bad news before I even said a word. I told her who I was, and there was a silence, so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she asked if we could meet in person, because some things, she said, were too painful to explain over the phone. We met at a small coffee shop downtown 2 days later. She walked in wearing gray, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes carrying the kind of sadness I recognized instantly because I saw it in my own mirror every morning. She sat across from me and apologized before I could even ask a single question, saying she never meant for any of this to unravel the way it had. She told me she and Margaret were engaged once, decades ago, before either of us knew the other existed, back when loving another woman meant losing your family, your career, everything Margaret had been raised to protect. Elise said Margaret chose safety over love, chose me over the truth of who she really was, and carried that secret silently for the rest of her life. I sat there stunned, grief and confusion crashing together inside my chest, staring at the woman who once held the same heart I thought belonged only to me. And somehow, despite everything, despite the impossible weight of what she just told me, I couldn't stop looking at her like she was the first real thing I'd felt in 3 years. Grief has a strange way of making you reckless, and nothing about what happened next made any logical sense, except that I couldn't stay away from Elise no matter how hard I tried. We met again the following week, then again after that, our conversations stretching later into the night each time, filled with stories about Margaret neither of us had ever shared with anyone else. Elise told me about the years after Margaret left her, how she moved across the country trying to outrun the heartbreak, how she never married because no one ever measured up to what she'd lost. She said buying that Mustang wasn't really about the car. It was about holding onto the last physical piece of a woman she never stopped loving, even from a distance, even after decades of silence. I told her things I'd never said out loud, not even to my closest friends. I told her how lonely I'd been since Margaret died, how Tyler and I barely spoke anymore, how I sometimes stood in that empty garage just to feel close to something that used to matter. Elise listened without judgment, her hand eventually finding mine across the table one night. And something about her touch felt like coming home to a house I never knew existed. I should have stopped it there. Instead, I fell deeper. We started spending entire weekends together, driving out to the coast, walking along beaches Margaret and I used to visit, except everything felt different with Elise beside me. Less like reliving old grief and more like discovering something entirely new. I found myself memorizing the way she laughed, the way her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup when she was thinking hard about something painful. I found myself falling for a woman who once loved my wife, and somehow that impossible truth only made the connection feel more sacred instead of wrong. Tyler noticed the change in me before I ever told him anything. He showed up at my house one evening, furious, saying rumors were already spreading through town about his father dating some strange woman connected to his mother's death. He didn't understand yet. He just saw betrayal, saw me moving on too fast, saw everything through the lens of his own guilt over selling that car in the first place. That's when Julian Voss entered the picture, claiming to be an old family friend of Elise's, showing up at her apartment unannounced with flowers and a familiarity that made my stomach twist every time I saw them together. Julian was smooth, confident, the kind of man who filled every room he walked into. He said he'd known Elise since college, that he'd always regretted not fighting harder for her attention back then, and now that fate had brought them back into the same city, he wasn't planning on wasting his second chance. I watched jealousy claw through my chest every time Julian touched her arm or whispered something that made her laugh in a way I convinced myself belonged only to me. Elise assured me Julian was just a friend, nothing more, but something about the way he looked at her told me he wanted far more than friendship, and he wasn't going to let a grieving widower stand in his way without a fight. One night, after a tense dinner where Julian showed up uninvited, I confronted Elise in the parking lot, my voice shaking with a possessiveness I barely recognized in myself. I asked her outright if she still had feelings buried somewhere for the kind of easy charm Julian offered, feelings that might pull her away from whatever fragile thing we were building together. She grabbed my face in both hands, tears in her eyes, and told me she'd spent her entire life loving someone who chose safety over truth, and she refused to spend what time she had left doing the same thing again. She said loving me terrified her because it meant finally being brave enough to want something real, something without secrets standing between us. Then Tyler found the letter. He came to my house while I was at work, going through old boxes in the garage looking for spare parts, and stumbled across the wooden box Walter had given me weeks earlier. He read every word of Margaret's letter to Elise, and by the time I got home, he was standing in my kitchen with tears streaming down his face, demanding to know how long I'd been hiding the truth about his mother, and accusing me of chasing after Elise for reasons that had nothing to do with love at all. Nothing prepares you for watching your own son look at you like a stranger. And standing in my kitchen that night, I realized Tyler's accusations were about to tear apart everything Elise and I had carefully built. He waved that letter in the air, his voice cracking between fury and heartbreak, asking how I could disrespect his mother's memory by falling for the woman she once loved and left behind. I tried explaining that I hadn't known any of this before Walter's call, that finding Elise felt less like betrayal and more like finishing a story Margaret never got the chance to complete. Tyler didn't want to hear it. He said I was using Margaret's old letter as an excuse to justify moving on too fast, dragging our entire family's grief into some twisted secret romance nobody asked for. Word spread through town faster than I could control it. Someone, I still don't know who, leaked pieces of Margaret's letter to a local gossip page, twisting the story into something scandalous and cruel. Suddenly, everyone believed Elise had been stalking our family for years, waiting for Margaret to die so she could finally claim what she'd lost decades earlier. The comments online were vicious, calling her manipulative, calling me pathetic, calling our entire relationship some kind of grief-driven delusion. Elise stopped answering my calls for 3 agonizing days. When she finally did, her voice sounded hollow, defeated in a way I'd never heard before. She said maybe Tyler was right. Maybe this was all just complicated grief wearing the costume of love, and maybe she needed to disappear again before she caused any more damage to my relationship with my son. That's when Julian made his move. He showed up at Elise's apartment while she was packing boxes, offering comfort, offering an easy escape from all the chaos surrounding us. He told her he could take her away from this town, away from the scandal, away from a relationship that clearly came with too much painful baggage attached. For one terrifying week, I didn't know if she'd already left with him, didn't know if I'd lost her the same way Margaret once lost her, through silence and fear instead of a real, honest goodbye. I went looking for her at the old dealership, some desperate hope pulling me toward the Mustang, like it might hold answers the rest of the world couldn't give me. Walter was there, cleaning the car for its next sale, and he told me Elise had come by that morning, sitting in the driver's seat for nearly an hour without saying a single word, before driving away with tears streaming down her face. I finally found her at the coastal overlook where we'd spent so many weekends together, standing at the edge of the cliff, staring out at water the same color as Margaret's old Mustang. I called her name, and she turned around slowly, her eyes red and exhausted, telling me she couldn't keep living inside a love story that started with someone else's heartbreak. She said Julian offered her something simple, something without ghosts attached, and part of her wondered if simple was exactly what she deserved after decades of loving people who could never fully choose her. I felt my whole world tilting on its edge, watching the woman I love consider walking away toward a man who offered ease instead of truth. Then Tyler showed up. He followed me there, still angry, still hurting, but something in his face had shifted since our last conversation. He walked straight up to Elise and apologized, his voice shaking as he admitted he'd spent the last week reading through more of his mother's old belongings, finding journal entries that confirmed everything in that letter. He said he finally understood his mother had spent her whole life quietly grieving a love she was too afraid to claim, and he refused to let his father repeat the same mistake out of fear of what other people might think. Elise stood frozen between the two of us, tears falling freely now, caught in a moment that felt like it could shatter or heal everything depending on what happened next. Standing at that cliffside with the wind howling around us, I understood I had exactly one chance to say something real before I lost Elise forever, either to Julian's easy comfort or to her own fear of loving someone tangled up in so much grief. I stepped forward, took her trembling hands in mine, and told her the truth I'd been too afraid to say out loud until that very moment. I told her I didn't love her because she reminded me of Margaret, and I didn't love her out of some strange need to finish a story that wasn't mine to complete. I loved her because of the way she listened without judgment, because of the way she made me feel like a man again instead of just a grieving widower going through the motions of life. I told her Margaret's letter wasn't a burden between us. It was proof that real love is worth fighting for, no matter how much time gets lost along the way. Tyler stood beside me, adding his own voice to the moment, telling Elise that he'd spent the last week wrestling with anger that wasn't really about her at all. He said he was scared of losing the version of his father he barely remembered, the version who used to laugh easily before grief hollowed him out. But watching me fight for something real, he said, taught him more about love than any of his mother's old letters ever could. Elise looked between the two of us, tears streaming freely now, her walls finally cracking after months of guarding herself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. She said she'd spent her whole life believing love always came with an expiration date, that people who claimed to love her eventually chose safety, chose easier paths, chose anyone but her. She said Julian offered simplicity, but simplicity had never once made her feel as alive as the complicated, messy, terrifying love she'd found with me. That's when Julian arrived, having followed her there himself, clearly sensing he was about to lose whatever advantage the chaos of the past week had given him. He tried appealing to her one last time, reminding her of the ease he offered, the freedom from scandal, the chance to start over somewhere nobody knew our tangled history. But Elise finally turned to him with a calm certainty I hadn't seen in her before, telling him gently but firmly that she didn't want ease anymore. She wanted truth, even when truth was painful, even when it came wrapped in grief and complicated family history. Julian left without another word, his charm finally failing him against something stronger than convenience. Elise turned back to me, closing the distance between us until there was nothing left but the wind and the sound of waves crashing below the cliff. She said yes, she was choosing this, choosing me, choosing a love that started in heartbreak but refused to end there. I pulled her into my arms, feeling 3 years of grief finally loosen its grip on my chest, replaced by something warm and impossibly hopeful. Months later, we stood together at that same dealership, Walter grinning as he handed me the keys to Margaret's old Mustang. Fully restored, the hidden compartment sealed, but the memory of what it once held forever changed. Elise slid into the passenger seat beside me, her hand resting over mine on the gear shift, and for the first time since Margaret's funeral, driving that car felt like honoring her memory instead of drowning in it. Tyler met us for dinner that weekend, bringing along a girl he'd been quietly dating, someone he said actually made him excited about Paris trips and future plans instead of running from grief the way he used to. He hugged Elise before we left the restaurant, telling her he was glad his father found someone brave enough to love him through all the mess. As Elise and I drove home that night, the top down, the coastal wind tangling through her hair, she leaned over and told me Margaret would have wanted exactly this. Two people finding their way back to love through the wreckage of loss instead of staying buried inside it forever. I reached over and squeezed her hand, watching the road stretch out ahead of us, finally certain that some stories don't end when we think they will. Sometimes they simply wait patiently for the right person to come along and finish them with love strong enough to survive everything that came before.